let's get into Lenin's Imperialism, Chapter 3. So the last chapter was about, or Chapter 1 was about the concentration of production, right? The concentration of industry, concentration of, say, the steel manufacturers and the iron manufacturers and the people who make the railroads and the people who make the means of communication. All of that becomes concentrated and it becomes monopolized in Chapter 1. That's facilitated by what we look at in Chapter 2, which is the concentration of banking, concentration of these different financial apparatuses, the concentration and monopolization of the banks, and the merger of those banks with industry, which is what we call finance capital. So especially with the rise of the stock market, the banks own shares and are the source of financing for a lot of the major manufacturers, a lot of the major industries like extraction and mining or oil drilling, things like that. The banks become concentrated, those industries become concentrated, and they become merged together, and they monopolize more and more markets. Now, Chapter 3, building off of those first two chapters about concentration, is about the financial oligarchy. So after the banks and the industry merge and monopolize, they take hold of the government, the state. They form a financial oligarchy, which is why Chapter 3 is called Finance Capital and the Financial Oligarchy. So in the first two chapters, we had the merger of banking and industry, and now we have the seizure of the state, the government, by banking and industry. So Hilferding is this bourgeois economist or bourgeois academic who Lenin quotes a lot in here because the bourgeoisie at the time, the ruling capitalist class, is noticing imperialism. They're noticing concentration and monopolization, and a lot of them are upset about it. A lot of them are saying this is bad. This is a bad direction for capitalism to go. And then a lot of them are saying, you know, this isn't even capitalism. This is crony capitalism. And Lenin, of course, in the last chapter said, no, this is just a natural development of capitalism. So as like we said, the banks increase their shares in industry, the amount of stock or shares that they own in all industries, this creates what we call finance capital, which is just a word for banking capital that's employed in industry. So this is basically what we talked about last time. I'm just reviewing my notes here. This is what we talked about before the intro. So Lenin says that capitalist, imperialist apologists don't reveal the real mechanisms of the system. They conceal them on purpose. So like I said, you have these folks like Hilferding who are realizing that imperialism and concentration are a thing, but they're saying like, oh, it's crony capitalism, right? This is happening because of the government, when in reality, it's just a development of capitalism. When capitalism is founded, when it first emerges, one of its core principles, one of its core elements is that it facilitates free competition. It is based upon free competition between capitalists and the market, and competition between them drives a lot of the motion of capitalism. And as the system itself develops, that principle element of capitalism, the principle of free competition, dialectically transforms into its opposite, monopoly. So competition between the capitalists and the market incentivizes them to control as much of the market as they can, which eventually, through time, through development, leads to a qualitative shift in how the market is structured, to where it's no longer a competitive market between a bunch of different equal or semi-equal firms, and it's now a market monopolized by a corporation, by a conglomeration of firms and banks, which is what we call finance capital and monopoly. So it's a dialectical transformation. And this is what a lot of the bourgeois economists ignore. This is a lot of what they fail to talk about in discussing imperialism. They fail to see that imperialism is just a stage of capitalism's development. So they say that originally, when the stock exchange becomes a thing, the stock market, or what Lenin calls a holding system, it these bourgeois ideologues are saying that this will allow the democratization of capital, right? Because now we have these shares, so workers and smaller capitalists can just buy whatever shares they want, and then this will lead to more equal distribution of wealth because more people will own shares, more people will have control of capital. It'll democratize capital and democratize the economy. But it actually worked the opposite because the big banks and the big industrialists would just buy up as many shares as they could with all the money they had. And all you have to do is get 50% of the shares or more, and you can control that company, right? You can appoint the board members. You are the majority shareholder and you're in charge. So it did the opposite of what these bourgeois economists were saying. Rather than democratize capitalism, it concentrated capitalism and sped up the concentration of banking capital and industrial capital. So the other thing that bourgeois ideologues common do, and it's interesting to hear Lenin talk about these things because they're still so common today, like the crony capitalism idea. You have so many libertarians today, some of them who are against imperialism, some who might as well just be neocons. But they don't recognize that imperialism stems from capitalism and capitalist relations of production. They think it's just the government doing bad things because that's what the government does. But the government is nothing but a tool of capital. So Lenin says that these people like the libertarians portray imperialism as just a bad habit of a certain nation, right? Something else that a lot of leftists do is just say imperialism is what the United States does, right? Imperialism is driven by the U.S. as a nation, which the U.S. is the leading capitalist hegemon, right? They are the leading imperialist hegemon. They are the dominant capitalist country in the global stage, and they drive the imperialism of these apparatuses like NATO, the IMF, and the World Bank. And the U.S. leads the imperialism of their allies like Canada and countries in West Europe. But that's just because most of the capital, most of the largest banks, and most wealthy industrial capitalists are located in the U.S. And because they were able to, or they were the richest country following World War II, and they were able to develop the fastest because there wasn't any fighting that happened in the US. It all happened in Europe and the Soviet Union. So they were able to emerge after that war as the dominant imperialist hegemon. But if it wasn't for Wall Street in Silicon Valley and the giant banks, right, and the giant global capitalists who are concentrated in the US, the US wouldn't be the imperial hegemon. If those capitalists were all concentrated in China, and China had the same economic system and economic structure that we have today, they would be the leading imperialist country, right? If their government had, if their capitalist class had seized control of their government after World War II, rather than their working class. It's not that the US is just this uniquely bad nation or our people are just uniquely immoral. It's the fact that capitalists and bankers, finance capitalists, have monopolized all the markets and all production into their own hands and then controlled the government, used their wealth, power, lobbying, campaign donations, control of the media to control the government, which they use to expand markets. They use to bail themselves out when they're in crisis. They use to do wars for expansion overseas. And a lot of these wealthy capitalists now sell weapons. They're involved in weapons contracting, so that makes money for them too, as does the whole military-industrial complex scam. So it all ties back to capitalism, right? It goes back to what we said in chapter 1 when we were first starting this series. Imperialism is not an action. It's not bad behavior. Imperialism isn't the Iraq War. Imperialism is a stage of capitalism. It's the economic system. It's the oil companies who dominate the government who wanted to go into Iraq so they could have access to that oil. So they, carried out this project of lying to the American public in order to justify this war. And now all of Iraq's oil belongs to Western companies. So yeah, imperialism as an economic system, not as an action, not as a bad habit. It's driven by the incessant expansion of the capitalist mode of production. So the stock exchange also allows easier fraud or easier, the capitalists are less easy to identify. So, like Vanguard and BlackRock, by example, everyone knows those giant investment groups who are, in control of most every industry in the United States, most every important one. They're not really beholden to anyone, and they're anonymous. We don't even know who the shareholders are that make up these investment groups. It's just the richest people in the country who hand over a bunch of their money and say, game the stock market, do stock speculation, buy, sell, and make my money turn into more money without me even having to do anything. So the stock exchange allows for more fraud, more concentration, more anonymity for the capitalists. And it allows for companies to just be juggled around after they go bankrupt, right? They just juggle around their shares, move them around a little bit, and then the company considers it a restructure. Just restructure who has ownership in their shares. So even Purdue Pharma, who went bankrupt because of legislation that they faced after the opioid crisis or surrounding the opioid crisis, because they lied to universities, they lied to doctors, they lied to regulatory institutions in order to promote the sale of and the prescription of Oxycontin, which maximized their profits, while downplaying the risks of addiction and overdose, which they knew about the whole time. So they face legislation and they have to pay a bunch of money, and then they go bankrupt, but then they just restructure who owns shares. So it's no longer the Sackler family, this family who became notorious for creating the opioid crisis, although they're still, major shareholders. They just give their shares to other people. They get juggled around, and the company changes its name to Noah Pharma, and they're still doing the same thing. They're still selling Oxycontin and still marketing it as if it's safe, and didn't create a crisis and kill thousands of people, which it did. So the stock market just essentially gives more power to finance capital. It gives them an easier path to controlling industry. Um, and like a legal development that comes out of the development of the stock market too is that laws have to be passed that ensure companies are beholden to their shareholders. Right? If you're going to be a publicly traded company, if you're going to belong to shareholders, your job, even if you're a healthcare organization, your sole goal is to maximize the payouts, the dividends, the profits of those shareholders. That is your sole purpose. You're not allowed to prioritize anything else. Even if you're part of the healthcare system, that's supposed to make people healthy. There are laws that say, nope, all you're supposed to focus on is your shareholder profits. So as the stock market comes about, concentration really increases, as does the ties of the finance capitalists to the government, which we're talking about here with the financial oligarchy. So you start to see a legal system, laws that represent what's going on economically. Such as laws ensuring that firms maximize the interests of their shareholders. So stock exchange allows an enormous concentration of capital in the hands of the banks. So you now have decentralized industry taking place all over the place with centralized concentration, right? Like there's tons of industry and agriculture here in the Midwest, but a lot of the shares in the big agricultural companies or big manufacturing companies here are owned by Bill Gates and owned by people in Wall Street, or people on Wall Street in New York. So scattered industries all around the country concentrate and are appropriated by a small group of people. The stock exchange also allows finance capitalists to purchase capital all over the world, right? Almost instantly. So this is also a feature of banks. They allow for money to be transferred and to move around much more quickly than they could before banking. But it also allows capitalism to go global because you can buy stocks all over the world now. And this leads to a massive expansion of profits when the stock exchange is first coming about. A massive increase in profits for the shareholders, for the corporations, but for the rest of society, we're essentially just paying them tribute for everything. Right? That's how Lenin says that the more that the stock exchange increases in prominence, the more that the rest of society has to pay tribute to them. So like BlackRock and Vanguard, those investment groups I was talking about, are majority shareholders or top 5 shareholders in all of the most profitable healthcare companies in the United States, right? So every time you go in for a checkup or you go in to get crutches because you sprained your ankle or whatever, you're not only paying for the healthcare, for the salaries of the doctor and the equipment that it takes to treat you, you're paying the salaries of insurance capitalists. You're paying the salaries of banking capitalists who are invested in the hospital that you're at. You're paying giant $1 million dividends for shareholders who have nothing to do with healthcare, right? They're not at the hospital. They probably never even seen the hospital that they're invested in. So this is every industry. And every time you buy something, you're paying tribute to these shareholders who own shares in that industry that produced whatever you're buying. So Lenin then details how the concentration of finance capital happened in every imperialist nation like Russia, the US, France, UK, etc. And how these were all aided by the emergence of holding systems, by the emergence of stock markets. So it happened differently in every country, but every country sort of followed along this similar path. Like I said, where there was concentration and it was greatly increased in speed by the emergence of holding systems or stock markets. France's concentration led to their economy being almost totally financialized. They largely had no industry or commerce at the time. The country was growing rich by usury alone, so by loaning money alone, which is very similar to the US economy today. There's a really good article by Michael Hudson called China's Industrial Socialism versus US Financialization. And we'll definitely bring that article up when we get to the chapter about the decay of imperialism here, because essentially imperialism leads to financialization. So not only do these banks and finance capitalists become the most powerful people in the economy and come to control the government, but they'll outsource a lot of the real industrial manufacturing jobs or the jobs, the mining jobs, the oil drilling jobs, because they can outsource it to a country who has a puppet government enacted that doesn't allow for a minimum wage or doesn't allow any unions, and have their products produced in a sweatshop for much cheaper. And then if they can make it so there's no tariffs on trade, if they have these free trade deals like NAFTA, which was enacted under the Clinton administration, there's no consequence to outsourcing jobs. So that's what's happened in the US. A lot of outsourcing, a lot of deindustrialization, a lot of factories and manufacturing plants being shut down, while a lot of real estate companies and banks and the people who give you your student loans have gotten richer and richer and richer and richer and come to be the most powerful people in the economy. Financialization. Oh, would you look at that? The Michael Hudson article I was talking about, I actually had it pulled up in my notes to talk about today. So there you go. America's neoliberal financialization policy versus China's industrial socialism. Great article, which I'll throw in the chat right now, that goes over this process of imperialism's decay and financialization versus China's manufacturing and investment in industry, which is why everything is produced in China right now, or why it seems that way, at least for Westerners. So again, the more usury, the more loans, the more debt that these corporations are using to become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, the more that they increase, the more that the citizenry, the working mass of a country is plagued or is paying tribute to the ruling class, because we owe our student loans to them, right? We owe a lot of this debt to the banks or to the real estate companies who own a lot of the housing. And I mean, we pay a lot out in rent too. There are all sorts of ways in which we pay tribute to these companies, but the burden of debt on the people in America is a great representation of the financialization process that we've undergone, where more and more of the richest in society are those who make money off of usury, loans, and debt. The banks, like 56% of Americans, I believe, is the stat. It depends on different studies that have been conducted, but over 50% of Americans have experienced medical debt at some point in their lives, and something like 10 to 20% have extreme medical debt right now. So again, even in healthcare, even in this industry that's supposed to be based on the public good and meeting people's needs and making our population healthy. Even that has become financialized and based on debt, throwing people into debt. And thankfully, you're not allowed to charge interest on medical debt, because someone somewhere along the line realized how messed up that would be, or maybe the nurses union organized against it or something. But still, it's still a burden on people, that debt is. And then, most forms of debt, are charged interest. So, not only are you paying tribute to the bank, but that tribute increases the more you have it and the more that you don't pay it back. It's really terrible. And that's why like the Quran and the Bible have all these verses about not being a usurer, not making your money through loans, not making your money by indebting others. Because it's imagine giving a loan to your friend. Your friend asks you for like $2 so he can do something, and you give him $2, and then he comes back and you're like, you owe me $6, right? You would never do that to someone on a personal level. But the banks do it all the time. They just have essentially systematized fraud and theft and ripping us off. So capital that's invested abroad. So companies who have invested their capital in another country have incredibly high rates of profit from the incredibly high rates of exploitation. So like I said, you can manufacture your product over in a foreign country in a sweatshop for much cheaper. And then as long as you have free trade deals like NAFTA, you can just ship it over here when you're ready to sell it and save a lot of money. So this leads to incredibly high profitability for the capitalists and banks, especially during times of economic expansion. However, this also leads to incredibly large crashes, incredibly large economic crises during times of economic downturn. So 2008 being a prime example. Now we might be seeing one approaching again. We have the Silicon Valley and Signature Bank recently went under, and the Biden administration bailed them out and said if we didn't do this, we would have been facing a collapse of of the entire financial system. So we may be approaching 2008 again, but with the concentration of finance capital, crises are no longer, crises were always bad. Economic crises always happen, but now they're huge, huge things that affect the entire globe. Because the entire banking system and entire financial system, which now dominates the capitalist economy, goes crash. And we all feel the effects of that. Although it gave us a great movie and It's a Wonderful Life. But when these crashes happen, banks are forced to sell off a lot of their capital cheaply to survive and rebuild. These financial crises become global events. Like in 2008, China was the only country to maintain a positive GDP in 2008 and the years following. And China helped bail out these big Western banks. They helped bail out the US in general. And our government bailed out these giant Western banks and some giant Western industries, which, like we said, are merged with the banks, of course. And they essentially are still in power today doing the same thing, making their money off of giving us subprime loans. And they were never punished. And the working class of America got screwed. The working class of America all remembers 2008 and the financial crisis as this terrible time, this terrible economic downturn where everyone was struggling and budgeting and everything was going under. But the people who created it, the people who caused it, the banks who dominate our economy, just got bailed out by the government, which goes back to the topic of this chapter, the financial oligarchy, the government or state control by the finance capitalists, by the banks and industrial capitalists. So the bourgeois economists always talk about this sense of responsibility for bankers, that the wealthiest capitalists have to run the economy well and avoid crisis and be fiscally responsible because it's on them. They always talk about this until the crisis happens, right? Then it happens. They're like, just bail us out, please. It was the people we were loaning the money to. It's their fault. They literally tried to say that after 2008. But these crises are inevitable. The 2008 crisis happened because the banks and real estate capitalists couldn't maintain their absurd profits. And they were giving people subprime loans, and basically just giving loans out like candy. So people would start paying them back and the banks would make money, but eventually people ran out of money because they never actually had enough money to pay those loans back. They were absurd. So the interest rate piles up. People eventually just get trapped in debt and start declaring bankruptcy. And that happened until the entire economy came tumbling down like a house of cards. So it is irresponsibility by the bankers because they knew they were doing something messed up and they continued to do it until everything came crashing down. But they have to continue increasing their rates of profit or they'll go under. That's how capitalism works. So yeah, they know that they messed up in 2008, but I guarantee you they're doing the same thing right now. They're giving super irresponsible loans right now because all they're trying to do with every action that they take is increase their profit, expand their markets, because that's what capitalism incentivizes the capitalists to do. So it almost makes them slaves to the system as well, who are, riddled with crises and destined to do imperialist action, because that's the only way to continually increase their profits and survive in the market system. Um, so yeah, capitalism creates crisis, and the concentration of capital into the financial oligarchy makes exacerbates those crises, makes them global, and makes them hit harder. Um, yeah. So post 2008, those banks were reorganized, restructured, and then they reinvested, right? They sold off a lot of their capital. There was this crash and a retraction of capital, a recession of capital. But then the banks were given all this bailout money, and then they turned around and reinvested. So every crisis leads to then a massive expansion of capital and a massive expansion of profits and wealth. And the capitalists and bankers never think it's going to end. They keep expanding, 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 and then boom, another crash happens again. But who cares? They get bailed out. It's the working people who have to suffer. So Lenin uses an example of a mining company that went under during a crisis in his time. The shares were reorganized away from their original owners and given to a bunch of bankers who owned one of the largest banks. So goes to show how the banks, or how capital concentrates in the hands of the bankers, and how crises accelerate this. They accelerate the transfer of industrial capital into the hands of the big banks, the merger of industrial and banking capital. So the banks have learned since Lenin's time to use crises as a tool, to use them as a tool of profit making. And they've used it as a tool to concentrate and to monopolize markets. It's pretty incredible, actually. So Lenin says on page 56, then I'm quoting him directly. He says, speculation in land situated in the suburbs of rapidly growing towns is a particularly profitable operation for finance capital. The monopoly of the banks merges here with the monopoly of rent, ground rent, with monopoly in the means of communication. So here he's talking about the merger, the conglomeration that dominates our country, if you live in the US, between real estate capitalists who charge you rent, who own housing and other forms of real estate, with banking capital, essentially forming a landlord / real estate monopoly, a monopoly made in hell, if you ask me. And Lenin adds in the telecom companies there. He adds in means of communication, which allows for housing projects to develop, where banks and landlords then charge people a bunch of rent and make a bunch of money off of those housing developments. You obviously see this all the time today, especially in growing areas like Denver, Colorado. You'll see housing developments everywhere, that are, of course, making millions and millions of dollars for bankers and shareholders on Wall Street or California or wherever they're at, or in Aspen, Colorado is where a lot of them live. But you could also throw in the utility companies today too. I don't know why Lenin didn't throw in utility companies then. Maybe they weren't as developed in Russia at the time. But not only do you have a merger of real estate capital, landlord capital, and banking capital, but you have utility capital, these companies like Alliant Energy, and these private companies who make millions of dollars in profit off of you heating your home. or doing other things that are necessary. So as these merge, they're more easily able to rip people off on rent, something that Lenin is realizing in 1917 that's really come to fruition today. In today's America, the rent is insanely high, and it continually grows as does the cost of living in general, while wages remain stagnant. But the reason the rent is so high is because the economy is dominated by this merger of banking and real estate capital. Those are a lot of the wealthiest people in the country, people who own your home and people who you are probably indebted to in some way because they gave you a loan at some point. There are working people right now are like desperate to own any kind of real estate, any kind of property that can make them passive income, like starting an Airbnb. A lot of people, like when their parents die, they'll turn their house into an Airbnb to try and make any kind of extra money so that they can retire someday. So real estate is a huge part of the financialized imperialist economy and profiting off real estate. I had an experience with that here in where I'm at when after we organized for this was after the Bernie Sanders campaign, but we still had a pretty good group of organizers who had formed out of that. And the next thing that we tackled was this luxury housing developer, this luxury real estate company who came in and were trying to smash the local trailer park. Where essentially what they did was bought the local trailer park, doubled or tripled everybody's rent, forced everybody to leave, and then moved to rebuild luxury homes. So we had to organize against it, organize basically and pressure the city into telling this luxury real estate developer that they couldn't come, that they couldn't just triple everyone's rent and force them off their homes, that was extortion. But you see how these luxury real estate companies operate and how much wealth and power they have. The fact that they were even considering doing this, evicting like 50 people out of their living situations, so you can build luxury homes for rich people and make absurd profits off of it. And that is the reason that there are more empty homes in this country than homeless people. Right? It's because of these real estate companies, these giant landlords, these banks who aren't going to house you unless you pay them rent. So even if we have enough houses for everybody, we're going to have people living on the streets in the cold because they can't pay rent to these multi millionaires on Wall Street. And these real estate developers will flock to growing areas where land prices are rising. Like I said, places like Denver, Colorado, over the last few years. I don't know if that's anymore, but so Lenin says something interesting here. He says that a lot of the bourgeois scholars at the time, who are arguing in favor of capitalism, are embracing American ethics, which is basically laissez-faire, free market, do as thou wilt ethics, which had always been condemned by European scholars, which European scholars had always looked at and said, that's stupid and that's callous and that's immoral. But they were increasingly being embraced as capitalism became global and as global finance capital spread. This American ethic of individualism, do what you want and build as much wealth as you can, and that's what makes you a good person. That's what makes you powerful. Step on other people's throats to do so. That kind of ethic, that kind of ideology started to become popularized globally, including in Europe. Very interesting thing that Lenin says there. And you see how intellectual production or ideology or information is all a product of the relations of production. It's all a product of the economic system. So as capitalism develops into its imperialist stage, its monopoly finance capitalist stage, and goes abroad, it also spreads this sort of ideology and brings this individualistic ethic along with it. So where the places where capitalism is transforming into its monopoly finance capital stage, says Lenin, the governments become financial oligarchies dominated by these capitalists. So we're finally getting into the name of the chapter here. We've mentioned it a handful of times, but now we're going to talk about the formation of financial oligarchies specifically. So Lenin says that once formed, monopolies penetrate every sphere of life, regardless of the government form. So even if there isn't a government dominated by the banks or the financial oligarchs, they're still going to have, control over almost every aspect of your life, just because of their control of the economy. However, government officials increasingly start to become employed by the banks or former employees of the banks. And we have the formation of what's called the revolving door. So politicians will spend time in office, and that time is basically an audition for the banking sector, an audition for a lucrative job banking. So there was this really popular politician that some people might remember named Paul Ryan. He was a Republican politician. I remember him because he was out of Wisconsin, but he retired from politics when he was in his 30s. I remember not understanding it. He was in his 30s or 40s, and people were saying that this guy was going to, potentially run for president, and he was potentially the future of the Republican Party. I didn't get it. But what he then did was took this super lucrative executive position with a giant bank. So his time in office, where he deregulated the economy and gave the big banks everything they wanted, and did everything that the imperialists wanted, was an audition for the banking sector. Then he gets out of office and he's got this cushy, lucrative job where he doesn't have to do much, but he can make millions of dollars for the rest of his life until we overthrow him in a socialist revolution. But at Lenin's time, during this monopolization process and financialization process, is when this revolving door first starts to become a thing. So one German bourgeois pro-capitalist author studying the transformation of capitalism into a plutocracy, which is just a government dominated by the rich. He said, the economic liberty guaranteed by the German Constitution has become, in many departments of economic life, a meaningless phrase. There's no more economic liberty. Even the widest political liberty cannot save us from being converted into a nation of unfree people. So here we see what I always talk about, the failure of liberalism to live up to its own ideals. Right? So you have these liberal revolutions, the overthrow of feudalism. In the U.S., you have the overthrow of slavery in the South, but and the murder of indigenous people who are already here. But in Europe, you have the overthrow of feudalism, and then these liberal Enlightenment ideals are used to found new governments. And it's based on freedom. It's based on freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of political expression. And in Germany, they had something written about economic freedom too. But as this process of concentration of finance capital plays out and the banks start to seize the state, there is no economic freedom. Any welfare state, any economic freedom for the people starts to be dismantled by the banks who control the government. And then they start to use those governments increasingly as a tool to bludgeon the working masses and prevent them from, engaging in revolutionary activity. They use the state as a tool of suppression for their own means. And in doing so, all those political rights and political freedoms that were promised during the founding of the country, promised in the Constitution, go away. They're overtaken because the dominant economic class doesn't want you to have freedom of political speech. If you had freedom of political speech and you were allowed to share TikToks without having 7 of your accounts banned like us, the people might move to socialism. They might overthrow the ruling economic class. So the ruling economic class can't allow it. And all these ideas about liberal freedom, all these liberal ideas of freedom and democracy become a joke, essentially. Like in the US, does anyone believe we have a democracy here where 93% of elections are decided by the candidate who raises the most money, and where our media is laughably controlled and concentrated into the hands of finance capitalists? Of course we don't have a democracy, yet that's what we're told our country is based on. And that's why we're told we have to go into Iraq and Afghanistan and kill millions of people to bring them democracy and freedom. It's a joke. These ideals that liberal democracies were founded on become laughable as capitalism develops and as the financial oligarchy is formed and banks and industrial capitalists come to monopolize the entire and control the entire political and economic system. So next I want to read something from the bottom of page 59 in my copy. This is Lenin speaking for himself, not quoting anyone. He says, "Is it characteristic of capitalism in general that the ownership of capital is separated from the application of capital to production, that money capital is separated from industrial or productive capital, and that the rentier who lives entirely on income obtained from money capital is separated from the entrepreneur and from all who are directly concerned in the management of capital? Imperialism, or the domination of finance capital, is that highest stage of capitalism in which this separation reaches vast proportions. The supremacy of finance capital over all other forms of capital means the predominance of the rentier and of the financial oligarchy. It means the crystallization of a small number of financially powerful states from all the rest. The extent to which this process is going on may be judged from the statistics on emissions, blah, 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 blah." He goes on to prove it. But he says here that in capitalism, the capitalist, the person who appropriates the product, appropriates what's produced, is disconnected from production. He doesn't actually work. He doesn't actually go into the factory 12 hours a day. His workers do it for him. He just takes their product. But with the concentration of capital and the move to the financialization, this separation becomes even greater, to the point where now, like I explained earlier, you have agriculture in the Midwest, farmers in the Midwest, whose profit is going to Bill Gates and is going to shareholders on Wall Street who have never been on a farm in their lives, who've probably never seen a pig or a cow in real life, who have no idea how farming labor works. They have no idea what goes into it. They have no idea how hard it is and how tough you have to be to do it. They don't know anything like this. Yet all of the profits from agricultural labor and agricultural activities go to people like Bill Gates. Complete and total separation of the capitalists in charge of production from the production process itself that they're appropriating the surplus of. Since Lenin's time, the U.S. dominated global financial system has really developed and allowed them to do this all over the place, allow them to exploit, like Bill Gates owns a lot of the agricultural stuff in Africa. So, literally from across the world, he's sucking wealth out of these places, complete separation of production and the capitalists in charge of production. Lenin says that every state turns into a rival imperialist state. At the end of World War II, and I would read Vijay Prasad's Washington Bullets if you want a better analysis of this. But the U.S. really takes over as the dominant imperialist hegemon. And along with that comes the development of U.S.-dominated financial systems globally. So you have the creation of the IMF and the World Bank after World War II, essentially global central banks dominated by the U.S. and Western finance capitalists. And then they create thousands and thousands of little arms, little tentacles, smaller, medium, and small-sized banks, which we talked about in Chapter 2, how large banks can control a conglomerate of other small banks. That's essentially what the entire world has now, except for socialist countries that have kicked the U.S. out and said, we're going to control our own banking system. That's what Libya tried to do before NATO killed Gaddafi. But the global financial system is now largely dominated by banks in the US and UK, shareholders on London and Wall Street, and then the US and UK government. Western finance capitalists. So the formation of oligarchies due to the dominance of finance capital happens at the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, which is at the same time this qualitative shift happens in capitalism from free competition into monopoly capitalism. You also have the seizure of the government by the monopoly capitalists and the finance capitalists. Qualitative shift, as we call it, from capitalism to its imperialist stage. So at this point, the French and the British are the dominant imperialist powers. They had most of the colonies. The U.S. and Germany were hot on their tail. This was during the turn of the century and in the lead up to 1917 when Lenin would publish this. Both the U.S. and Germany, who Lenin said were hot on the tail of the French and the U.K., would go on to try and seize and dominate the entire world within the next 30 years. So it's safe to say that Lenin nailed that prediction. As the imperialist oligarchies were developing in Germany, That would culminate in Hitler trying to seize the whole world. And then in the US, it would culminate in them pretty much seizing the whole world and creating the unipolar system that we have today, or that's crumbling today with the growth of China and the anti-imperialist world. But Lenin says, or calls these four countries, the UK, French, US, and Germany, the four pillars of finance capital. Today, that's basically just the US and West Europe. You know, the IMF and the World Bank is the central global pillar of finance capital, which all other finance capital operations rotate around or are connected to or concentrated into. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank, but then you also have Goldman Sachs, US Bank, Citibank, all these giant Western banks that have tendrils everywhere and control capital and shares everywhere. So all the same people for the most part. And now China is offering a direct counter to US finance capitalist dominance with BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiative, where China is taking their state-owned banks, these banks owned by the Chinese government, which is controlled by the Chinese workers, Chinese working people, or the Chinese masses, and they're offering countries in Africa or countries in Latin America or countries in the Middle East, especially those countries who have been devastated and sanctioned and bombed by the US for years, developmental loans. China's saying, we'll give you these loans similar to the loans that the US gave their West European allies after World War II in the Marshall Plan to help build them up, with very low interest, about 4% interest rates. And China's actually been forgiving a lot of the debt too when countries are unable to pay it. But it allows these countries to develop industry, which is what the US financial system prevents them from doing. Right. So the US global dominated financial system allows them to say, okay, Venezuela, you're trying to move towards socialism and your main industry is oil. We're not going to finance any oil capital. We're not going to finance any kind of development in Venezuela that's not going to Western multinationals. And we're not going to finance any kind of development aimed at diversifying your economy. Right. So Venezuela wanted to take their oil and use that to develop other sectors of their economy, agriculture, their education sector, things like this, and welfare programs as well. So the US can say, we're not going to finance anything else. So, you're only going to be able to get financing for oil if that's oil that Western multinationals have access to. And pretty much every country in the global economy relies on financing from the IMF and the World Bank, which the DPRK is the only country who's not part of the IMF and World Bank, which is crazy that they've been able to survive despite that. But it puts them at a huge disadvantage. Famously, Richard Nixon, after Salvador Allende, the socialist, was elected in Chile, he said, make the economy scream. And IMF and World Bank financing in Chile went from $200 million a year to $2 million a year. So things like this, right? When a socialist government takes power, that country's used to financing from the IMF and the World Bank, and the IMF and World Bank can just cut it off, or they can bring it down to almost nothing. This is the power that this global US-dominated financial system gives the Western finance capitalists, that it gives these Western banks and Western industrialists, both economically and politically, because they can use this to control the political systems of whatever country they want. So China coming in and saying, no, you don't have to take out a loan with the IMF and the World Bank, which is also going to be a super high interest loan aimed at trapping countries in debt, like the notorious structural adjustment loans from the IMF and World Bank, and then make those countries subservient to the West. Rather than that, China's saying, come take out a loan with us, build up your industry, your productive capacity, so you become self-sufficient, so you're not reliant on financing from the West and from the IMF and the World Bank, and then we won't trap you in debt, right? And this is why China is driving the US crazy with what they're doing. They just keep investing, developing, forging alliances, investing, developing, signing a new country to BRICS, investing, developing. And the US can't do anything about it. It's like, this authoritarian trade and economics going on. China giving these countries industry is so authoritarian, right? It does sound ridiculous, the things that the U.S. is saying, especially since they've kept these countries in debt and tried to destroy them for so long. But it's China playing the long game, and that's why it's so funny when people say that, China is imperialist because they have finance capital. Right? China's imperialist because of the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're giving loans to other countries. They're doing exactly what the IMF and World Bank did. When if you look at the way the BRICS system is structured and China's loans are structured, they're structured as a direct counter to the U.S. structural adjustment loans to the IMF, World Bank, and U.S.-dominated financial system. They're giving countries a lifeline to get away from this terrible, decrepit, exploitative financial system, because China understands Marxism, Leninism. They understand how capitalism works. They understand how the Western finance capitalists tick, what they're actually after, which is exploitation, cheap resources and labor, ultimately to maximize their surplus value, for increased surplus value. So, and they understand that imperialism prevents the productive forces in various countries from developing, which we'll talk about a lot more when we get to the chapter on export capital. So by China developing industry in these countries, it makes them less susceptible to U.S. imperialist tactics and economic warfare. It makes them less subservient to the West and their financial organs. So China is not going against Lenin. They're not going back on what Lenin wrote and moving towards imperialism and neocolonialism. Rather, they understand Lenin, they understand neocolonialism, so they've moved to create a financial system that's not capitalistic and imperialistic, that can counter the capitalistic and imperialistic financial system of the West. So the next chapter, that's the end of chapter 3. The next one that we will go over is the chapter on export capital. This is my favorite chapter in the book because it helped me understand Venezuela, which I had been studying at the time that I read this. We're going to talk about the way that capitalists export capital to a country that they're trying to exploit, because say if that country has a lot of oil, the Western finance capitalists are going to export oil drills, but then the entire economy in that country develops around oil in a very exploitative fashion, because all of the surplus from that oil, rather than going to capitalists in Venezuela, who can then invest it elsewhere and lead the economy to develop, the industry to develop, the surplus of the Venezuelan oil is being sucked out of Venezuela and brought to America and the UK. It's being brought to Europe and North America. So it's not being used to diversify the Venezuelan economy, and the whole economy then becomes dependent on oil. So when they try to transition to socialism, the US sanctions their oil, and it essentially shuts down their entire economy. And then Western social democrats like Naomi Klein will come out and be like, oh, Venezuela is not real socialism. They're bad and stupid because they're too dependent on oil, and oil's bad for the environment. It's like, well, they're dependent on oil because of 100 years of colonialism, imperialism, and export capital. Export capital. And then, of course, the IMF and World Bank isn't going to finance the development of anything except for oil that's controlled by Western multinationals. I was referencing Venezuela with that example I was using earlier. So, yeah, that's the next chapter, and I'm real excited for that because I think it's real important to understanding imperialism, and imperialism not just as an action, but as a stage of capitalism's development. Right? You have to understand the export capital that prevents countries' economies from developing, that allows Western multinationals to suck economic value out of these countries, that leads to massive profits in the West, in the imperialist countries, which they then become reliant on. Right? And as we know, capitalism forces you to continually expand your profits. So if you make super profits off Venezuela, the next year you got to make more. So what are you going to do? Are you going to move on and exploit Colombia or Ecuador or more countries, more colonies? You have to. You have to find some way to increase your profits. Maybe you should increase the interest that you're charging people on the debt that they owe you. Who knows? But this is how capitalism works and how it leads to imperialism and parasitism. Chapter 3 complete. We did it.